The kids will get used to it. They'll have a new father soon. I wasn't supposed to hear it. The words slid through the crack of the half-closed kitchen door like smoke seeping under a doorway. And in that instant, the world I thought I knew tilted. A new father for my children. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The kitchen clock ticked past 9:47 p.m., each second landing heavy in the silence. Outside, cicadas buzzed against the damp Florida night, their drone pressing through the screen windows. I had just come home from a long haul, 12 hours on the road in my old 2008 Ford pickup. The truck still carried the smell of diesel and stale coffee, my daily perfume as a man who made his living one delivery at a time. $3,500 a month to keep the lights on, the mortgage current, food on the table. I should have walked in and kissed my wife, maybe peeked in on my kids. Instead, I froze in the hallway, my hand brushing the rough wallpaper we never replaced. The house seemed to hold its breath with me. Helen's voice followed, soft but sharp. "Mother, please, not now." But Margaret, my mother-in-law, pressed harder. "Richard is slipping. He's tired. You can't rely on a man who barely holds this family together. The children need stability. Daniel can give them that." Daniel, a name I didn't recognize, but already it hung in the air like a hammer waiting to fall. My heart pounded against my ribs, a rhythm faster than any engine I'd ever pushed down I-75. Who was Daniel? How long had they been speaking about him in hushed tones, and how could they speak so casually about replacing me, as though a father was nothing more than a light bulb you could unscrew and change when it flickered? I wanted to storm in, demand answers, pound the table until they remembered who I was. But I stayed in the shadows, clutching the strap of my work bag, listening to pieces of my life fracture like glass underfoot. Every father carries a quiet fear that one day his presence won't be enough, that his children will reach for another hand, another voice, another shoulder. That night, I heard my fear spoken aloud, given shape and plan by the very people I trusted most. It felt like I had been thrust into a cruel family drama, one where loyalty was fragile and betrayal was written in whispers. And as their words sank into me, one question burned hotter than the Florida heat. How do you fight to keep your place as a father when the people closest to you have already buried you alive? The mornings always started the same. My old 2008 Ford pickup sat in the driveway, its blue paint sun-faded, the left mirror held together with duct tape. I bought it for $5,200 cash from a lot off Dale Mabry Highway in Tampa. The dealer swore it would run another 100,000 miles. I didn't care about that. I just needed something steady, something that would carry Ethan and Clara to school, and me to the long roads that kept our family afloat. The cab smelled of crayons and coffee. Ethan's soccer cleats were wedged under the passenger seat. Clara's glittery backpack straps dangled over the edge, catching the sunlight like a stubborn reminder that childhood never stayed tidy. "Dad," Ethan said one morning as we rolled past the Hillsborough River, the water flashing silver in the early light. "Do you think I could play soccer in college?" I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. 14 years old, already stretching tall, his voice balancing between boy and man. "You put in the work, son. You can do anything. College isn't about who you know, it's about what you give," Clara chimed in, her voice smaller, but no less certain. "I want to study art. Maybe New York. Maybe Paris." She said Paris as if the word itself were a key to another world. I laughed softly. "Paris, huh? That's a long way from Tampa. But if that's your dream, Clara, we'll find a way." The road hummed beneath us, steady and sure. For a moment, life was simple. My hands on the wheel, their voices filling the cab, the smell of toast from the breakfast sandwiches we'd packed still lingering. At red lights, I sometimes caught my reflection in the cracked side mirror. Lines etched deeper into my face than I remembered, gray pushing against the black in my beard. A man of 60 who carried the weight of every mile. But when I looked at them, all that faded. They were my compass, and every delivery I made, Every $3,500 paycheck that trickled in each month was for their tomorrows. Yet beneath the warmth of those rides, I couldn't shake what I had overheard in the kitchen. Helen's silence. Margaret's whisper. The name Daniel. It lurked like a shadow in the back seat, invisible to the kids but pressing on me. Was I the only one still fighting to keep us whole? One Saturday morning, Clara leaned her head against the window, eyes half dreaming. "Dad, when you drop us off, can you stay for the art show? I want you to see what I painted." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. Ethan smirked. "She's actually pretty good, Dad. You'll be surprised." They laughed together, and for a moment I let the sound cover the doubt gnawing at me. But somewhere deep, I felt it. The calm before a storm. The quiet surface hiding deeper currents. Families break not always with thunder, but with whispers. And whispers were already circling in my home, threads of deceit woven where love once held strong. As I pulled into the school lot, watching them step out, backpacks bouncing, voices alive with possibility, a thought struck me like a sudden crosswind. How long before their dreams carried them away, and left me behind, just another character in someone else's revenge story? It began with small things. Helen no longer waited up for me when I came home late from a delivery. Dinner plates were stacked neatly in the fridge, covered in foil with a note. Microwave for 2 minutes. Her perfume, once a soft welcome by the doorway, had become faint, almost absent. I told myself she was tired, that 60 carried its own quiet weight. But the truth lingered. Something had shifted. At the breakfast table, I noticed the children leaned more toward her words than mine. Clara would glance at her mother before answering me, as if seeking silent approval. Ethan, who once asked me to check his homework, now handed his math sheet to Helen. It wasn't rebellion. It was alignment. A slow redrawing of lines in a family portrait that was once solid. One evening, after the kids had gone upstairs, I tried, my voice steady, though my hands trembled against the kitchen counter. "Helen, is there something you want to tell me?" She didn't look up from rinsing a plate. "You're imagining things, Richard. You work too hard, that's all. Don't turn this into my hours. I heard something, Helen. About the kids. About a new father." Her shoulders stiffened. She set the plate down, too gently, like someone who knew force would betray what they were holding inside. "You misunderstood," she said, eyes still fixed on the running water. "Did I? Or are you just afraid to answer me?" The faucet hissed louder than her silence. Later that week, Gerald and Margaret came by. Helen's parents had always carried themselves with an air that suggested they belonged in finer rooms than ours. Gerald leaned back in my worn recliner, crossing his legs as if to test the strength of the springs. Margaret wandered the living room, pausing at framed photos, sighing as though the house itself had disappointed her. "You're still driving that truck?" Gerald asked finally, a smile tugging at his lips, but not the kind that reached the eyes. "It pays the bills," I said. "Barely," Margaret added. "A man your age should be thinking of stability. What happens when the miles run out? What then, Richard?" Their words cut deeper than they knew. Or maybe they knew exactly how far they reached. I thought of every mile marker on I-75, every rest stop coffee at $1.89, every night I pulled in exhausted just to keep food on the table. I thought of Helen, watching them, silent, not once stepping in. That night, lying in bed beside her, the ceiling above us felt heavier, like plaster pressed by something unseen. A roof protects a family, but only if the foundation holds. And I could feel it, hairline fractures running beneath us, cracks widening with each unspoken word. How long before the whole house caves in? The first sign was not dramatic. It was a tightness in my chest after carrying 2 grocery bags up the porch steps, the kind of weight that felt heavier than it should. At first, I blamed the Florida humidity, the long hauls, the stale coffee from gas stations that had been brewing since dawn. But when it happened again, this time while lifting Ethan's baseball gear into the trunk, I couldn't ignore it. The doctor's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and paper, the kind of place where time slows down. He was calm, almost too calm, when he said, "Richard, you need to take 6 months off. No long hours, no heavy lifting. Your body is telling you to stop. 6 months." That was 180 days without paychecks, without $3,500 a month, without the overtime that had kept Clara in piano lessons and Ethan on the baseball team. My mind turned to numbers faster than it turned to health. The Ford still had a loan balance of $2,800. The mortgage in Tampa stood at $940 a month. Groceries for 4 of us, never less than $150 a week. Who would cover those miles if I wasn't behind the wheel? When I told Helen, she stood by the window, arms folded, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the yard. "So, you won't be working," she said, the words landing not as sympathy but as judgment. "I just need time. I'll get back on my feet." Her lips curved in something between pity and calculation. "The kids need stability, Richard. If you can't give it, someone else might have to." The sentence hung there, sharp as glass. I wanted to argue, to remind her of every mile I had driven, every night I came home so tired I fell asleep in my boots. But her silence pressed harder than her words. In the quiet, I realized what this was. Illness wasn't just a weakness in my body. It was an opening in the wall of our home. And Helen was ready to step through it. The beginning of deceit was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived as softly as a whisper, hidden in concern, wrapped in a smile that didn't reach the eyes. That night, lying awake, I kept hearing the doctor's voice. 6 months. Rest. Stop. But another question echoed louder. If I step away for a while, will they wait for me, or will I return to find I've already been replaced? If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. It started small, like a rumor whispered in the corner of a diner. Then it spread, quick and quiet, until even the neighbors on Maple Street were lowering their voices when they saw me pass. Gerald and Margaret were the first to plant the seed. "Richard's gone on a long haul," they told anyone who asked. "Might not be back for months." A pause, a sad shake of the head, then the words that made my chest ache harder than the doctor's warning. "No one really knows if he's coming back." Funny thing, I was still right there in Tampa, sitting on that sagging couch with the torn armrest, my Ford parked out front like a soldier on standby. Missing? The only place I'd gone was the clinic and back, yet suddenly I was a ghost in my own home. There's a certain family drama that plays out not in screams or slamming doors, but in well-crafted lies told at church picnics and whispered across back fences. One night, as I lingered by the hallway, I heard Helen's voice drift into Ethan's room. "Your father, he may never return." Her tone was rehearsed, like she was reading lines from a script. Clara's small voice asked, "But where is he? Why didn't he say goodbye?" The silence that followed was crueler than any answer. That was when Daniel Moore stepped in. A name I had heard before, a man from Helen's office, single, neat hair, polished shoes. At first, it was little things. He dropped off a bag of groceries. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the back door. Then suddenly, he was everywhere. At Ethan's baseball game, cheering louder than I ever had strength to. At Clara's recital, handing her a bouquet of roses I couldn't afford. Neighbors nodded approvingly, and Gerald slapped Daniel on the back like he'd found a son he wished he'd had all along. I watched from across the field one Saturday, leaning against my Ford, my hands trembling not from illness, but from the bitter taste of being replaced while still alive. What kind of disappearance is it, I wondered, when the man himself hasn't gone anywhere, only his place in the family has been erased? It was a Saturday afternoon, warm enough that the Florida air pressed against the skin like damp cloth. I parked my old Ford across the street from the schoolyard, engine off, windows cracked just enough to let the heavy breeze in. From the driver's seat, I could see the children spilling onto the grass after Clara's rehearsal. Their laughter carried, light and careless, while mine stayed locked somewhere deep in my chest. Daniel Moore was already there, dressed sharp as always, clean button-down, polished brown shoes that reflected the sun. He bent low, arms open wide, and Clara ran straight into them. I could hear her small voice from where I sat, sharp and clear as a knife. "Daddy!" The word sliced through me. It was a title I had earned with scraped knuckles, sleepless nights, and 1,000 miles driven in a rattling truck just to keep the lights on. Now it rolled from her lips like it belonged to him, like I had never existed. Ethan followed behind, hesitant, glancing once in my direction as if he sensed me there. But he said nothing, only watched as Daniel lifted Clara off her feet, spinning her in circles the way I used to when my back was stronger. In that moment, I wasn't a father. I was an intruder watching his own life unfold with a new lead actor. The audience clapped, smiled, nodded at the perfect family picture. And me? I was the shadow at the edge of the frame, erased before anyone thought to ask who had painted the original portrait. Inside, a question burned so hot it hurt to think it. How do you bury a man who is still alive? The cruel elegance of it all struck me. It wasn't a loud betrayal, no public declaration of abandonment. It was quieter, like erosion. One grain at a time, until the foundation gave way. A perfect act of deceit, performed in broad daylight with roses and applause. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. Was this the death of my fatherhood or just the intermission before a different ending? The call came on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the clouds seemed to sag under their own weight. I was sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug in a diner off Highway 301 when my phone buzzed. The name on the screen pulled me straight back to another life, Ms. Karen Blake. She had taught Ethan in 4th grade, the kind of teacher who remembered birthdays and sent handwritten notes when a kid was sick. Her voice was low, careful, almost like she was afraid someone else might be listening. "Richard," she said, "I came across something that doesn't sit right with me." I leaned forward, heart thumping. "What is it?" She hesitated, then continued. "The school records, Ethan and Clara's files. They've been altered. Your name as their father has been removed. It now lists Daniel Moore." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered onto the table. I stared at the formica surface, its scratches suddenly looking like scars. "That can't be right," I whispered. That's not just a mistake," Karen sighed. "I checked twice. It's not a clerical error. Someone went in intentionally. I thought you deserved to know." Intentionally. The word echoed in my head like the clang of a prison door. It wasn't only Helen's cold shoulder or Margaret's sharp tongue anymore. This was no longer a matter of hearts growing distant. This was a calculated erasure, legal ink replacing flesh and blood. I tried to swallow, but the coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "They've turned me into a ghost on paper," I muttered. A ghost in my own children's lives. The diner suddenly felt too small, too loud, the hum of the fridge mocking me. Around me, people laughed over breakfast specials, eggs for $4.99, pancakes stacked high. Ordinary life moved on, blind to the quiet storm ripping through mine. A thought cut deeper than the rest. If they can erase my name from a school record, what stops them from erasing me everywhere else? It dawned on me with chilling clarity. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a blueprint, a strategy to replace me completely, piece by piece, until even the law would call Daniel father. For the first time, I realized this wasn't only a family drama. It was a war, disguised in paperwork and polite lies. I ended the call with a hollow, "Thank you," slid the phone back into my pocket, and sat in silence. My reflection in the diner's window looked pale, worn, but still breathing, and breathing meant fighting. But the question gnawed at me. What good is a father's love if the world has already signed him out of existence? The evening light fell across the Harris living room like a tired spotlight, catching dust motes in the air. I hadn't meant to be there that night, but some part of me wanted answers no paper trail could provide. Helen sat stiffly on the sofa, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Gerald pretended to read the Tampa Tribune, and Margaret busied herself with a bowl of fruit she had no intention of eating. The silence was the kind that rattled in your ears. Finally, I spoke. I know about the records. My name is gone. Daniel's is there instead. Tell me, Helen, was it you? Her eyes flicked up, cold and steady. You were weak, Richard. I needed someone stronger. The words landed sharper than any blade. For a moment the room tilted. I could almost hear the tearing sound of something inside me breaking, like fabric stretched too far, finally giving way. I laughed, though it came out cracked. Stronger? Daniel? He's a man who stepped into my shoes while I was fighting to hold this family together. Helen's voice hardened. You were gone. You were tired. You couldn't provide the life they deserved. I had to think of the children. I leaned forward, my voice low, trembling. The children don't need a replacement. They need their father. They need me. Margaret chimed in, her tone thick with disdain. What they need is stability. You were always a truck driver, Richard. Always on the road. Always one breakdown away from ruin. I turned to Gerald, but he didn't even lower his newspaper. The paper shielded his face, but I could see the faintest smirk curling at the edges. Inside, rage twisted with grief. Weak, replaceable, forgotten. Her words clung to me like tar. I wanted to shout, to shatter every window in that house with the sound of my fury. But instead, I stood still, watching Helen, memorizing her face as though I might one day use it as evidence. And then I realized this was no slip of emotion. This was deceit dressed in calm voices and careful logic. They had planned this. They had rehearsed it. Helen's confession wasn't an apology. It was a declaration. I walked out without another word, the night air slapping me awake as I hit the porch. The Florida humidity clung to my skin, sticky and relentless. Somewhere down the street, a sprinkler hissed like a snake in the grass. I whispered to myself, maybe I was weak, but weakness isn't permanent. And if strength is what it takes to reclaim my children, then they haven't seen me yet. Still, a question burned like a coal I couldn't spit out. How do you fight for love in a house where your very existence has been rewritten? If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. 8 years passed, not in a rush but in a slow, grinding drip. Days bled into nights, and nights into mornings that felt the same as the last. I rented a single room above a hardware store in St. Petersburg, a place that smelled of sawdust and mildew. Nobody asked questions there, and I offered no answers. My health had faltered after the confrontation with Helen. The doctor at Bayfront told me, "Your blood pressure's like a ticking time bomb. Stress will kill you before the road does." He prescribed pills I couldn't always afford, so I stretched them out, one every other day. It wasn't discipline, it was poverty disguised as strategy. Work came in scraps, fixing gutters for $70, unloading crates for $50 cash under the table, cleaning out a storage unit someone abandoned. I kept every receipt, every scribbled invoice, every envelope of wrinkled bills. But more important than survival was what I did with the little I earned. Every month, no matter how thin the wallet, I sent something for my children. Sometimes it was $500, sometimes $300, sometimes less. Always under my name. Always recorded. I kept carbon copies of the money orders stacked in an old shoebox under my bed like sacred relics. Proof I existed. Proof I cared. Proof that though they had been taught to erase me, I was still there. I imagined them opening envelopes, though I knew in my gut Helen or Daniel intercepted most of it. Did the kids ever see those bills? Did they ever notice the familiar handwriting on the slips? Or had Daniel already taught them to dismiss it, to say, "That's not from your father, that's just some mistake"? On Sundays, when the church bells rang down Central Avenue, I would sit by the window and write in a worn leather notebook. Not letters to anyone in particular, just records, dates, amounts, feelings I couldn't share aloud. The notebook grew thick with 8 years of silence. Like a river dammed by stone, love still flowed beneath, pressing, waiting, eroding the wall one drop at a time. Sometimes I laughed at myself, a bitter chuckle echoing in the empty room. "Congratulations, Richard," I'd mutter. "You've become the ghost who pays child support." The absurdity stung, but the routine kept me tethered to life. Without those monthly envelopes, without that shoebox, I might have drifted into nothing. I stayed away, healed slowly, worked endlessly. Yet even in those quiet years, I never stopped asking the question that gnawed at me in the dark. What kind of father am I if my children don't even know I'm here? The gymnasium at Clearwater High was packed to the rafters. Folding chairs stretched in endless rows, parents clutching programs, the brass band stumbling through pomp and circumstance for what felt like the 1,000th time. The air buzzed with pride, relief, and a hint of sweat. Banners hung overhead. Class of 20XX, the future begins today. Richard hadn't planned on coming, but when he saw Ethan's name printed in the local paper under Honors Graduates, something pulled him here like gravity. He stood near the back, pressed against the wall, heart pounding harder than it ever had on the highway. 8 years of distance collapsed into this one humid afternoon. Helen sat 3 rows from the front, her posture sharp as glass. Daniel beside her, suit too polished for the occasion, wore the smile of a man who had claimed something not his. Their hands brushed casually, like it had always been this way, like Richard was the stranger in this picture. From where he stood, it was an act of quiet deceit, a rewriting of family history that most people would never question. When Ethan's name was called, applause thundered. He strode across the stage in his cap and gown, lanky now, shoulders broader, his stride confident. For a second, Richard barely recognized his own son. And then, just as the principal handed him the diploma, Ethan's eyes swept across the crowd. They locked. A fraction of a second. A break in the music, in the chatter, in the ceremony itself. The boy's smile faltered. His steps slowed. Richard felt it like a jolt to the chest. Ethan saw him. Ethan. But then, as quickly as it came, it vanished. Ethan blinked, turned back toward the stage, and the moment was swallowed whole by cheers. Richard remained at the back, invisible again, the ghost who had walked into daylight. The band resumed. Names kept coming. Applause rolled on. Yet Richard's world had frozen at that single glance. Did Ethan recognize him? Or was it just a trick of resemblance, a man in the crowd who looked like a forgotten shadow? He pressed a hand against the wall to steady himself, the noise of the room falling away, replaced by a quieter question, heavier than any he had asked before. What happens when a son meets his father's eyes, but pretends he never did? The house smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. Richard hadn't set foot inside the old Harris place in years, but he knew every corner. The furniture was the same, though shinier, as if time itself had been buffed to look presentable. He moved quietly, as though one wrong step might awaken ghosts. In a way, it already had. On the oak desk in Clara's old room, beneath a stack of yearbooks and abandoned textbooks, he found it. A thin white envelope, edges yellowed with time. His name written in Clara's looping script, slanted, careful, almost apologetic. His hands trembled. For a long while, he simply held it, staring as though the paper itself might burn him. Finally, he slid a finger under the flap and opened it. "Dear Dad," it began. "I don't know if this will ever reach you. They say you're gone. They say it's better to stop waiting. But I still look for you. At the bus stop, at the grocery store, at the baseball bleachers when Ethan plays. I always think maybe you'll just appear." The words blurred as his eyes watered. He wiped them quickly, unwilling to let the letter win over him too easily. "Mom says you left us. Grandpa Gerald says you weren't strong enough. Grandma Margaret says we need stability. And Daniel just acts like you never existed. But I remember your old truck, the way you whistled in the mornings, the smell of gasoline and soap when you hugged me after work. I don't care what they erase. You are my dad. Richard sat on the edge of her bed, the springs creaking like old bones. His chest felt hollow and full all at once. Every sentence was a knife, yet every word was also a stitch trying to mend something torn. At the bottom, Clara had signed her name, but beneath it she had written in smaller letters, "I'm sorry I can't send this. They won't let me. But maybe one day you'll know I never forgot you." He pressed the paper to his forehead, breathing in the ink, as if the scent might carry her voice. For the first time in years, he realized the narrative spun around him wasn't complete. The family drama was not a single painting, but a mural, with pieces hidden behind curtains and walls. They had told him he was erased, but here was proof that at least one heart had resisted the rewrite. His hands folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. He would not leave it here to be buried again. The question rose inside him, unshakable. If my daughter remembered me through the lies, what else has been hidden in the silence of these years? Richard had never been a man of paperwork. His life was measured in miles driven, pay stubs creased from his back pocket, oil stains on his hands. But now, his survival, and the truth, demanded documents. They became his new cargo, each one heavier than a truckload of freight. He started with the basics: birth certificates. Ethan's and Clara's, tucked away in a county office file in Tampa. He waited an hour under flickering fluorescent lights while a clerk printed duplicates for a fee of $45 each. His name was still there, black ink declaring him father, though he knew somewhere Daniel's shadow hovered, waiting to erase it. From there he gathered receipts. Old Western Union transfers, $500 one month, $300 another. Each small sum proof that even in his absence, he had been present. He collected the letter Clara had written, folding it into a plastic sleeve like it was a holy relic. He found a copy of a hospital bill with his signature on the insurance line, his handwriting, undeniable, etched in blue ink. By late evening, his kitchen table in the rented Orlando apartment looked like a crime scene. Papers scattered like broken glass, each one reflecting the past from a different angle. He couldn't decide whether this was a love story in fragments or an obituary written by bureaucracy. The next morning, he met a lawyer. Daniel Ortiz, a man in his early 40s with sharp glasses and a sharper tone, ran a modest office on Orange Avenue. The waiting room chairs were cracked vinyl, the kind that squeaked when you shifted your weight. The sign out front leaned slightly to the left. Still, Richard didn't care about polish. He needed grit. Ortiz flipped through the papers, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "Mr. Harris, I'll be straight with you. This isn't just about names on paper. This is about narrative. They've been building theirs for years. We'll have to dismantle it brick by brick. My retainer is $2,000. Richard swallowed hard. $2,000 was nearly a month's wages in his best trucking days. But this wasn't about money. This was about blood. He slid the cash envelope across the desk. "Do it," he said simply. Ortiz leaned back, tapped the papers with his pen. "This is going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that?" Richard's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "It's already ugly. I'm just shining a light on it. If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more." The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and dust, like old secrets kept under lock and key. Richard sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped so tightly that the veins stood out like blue rivers. Across the aisle sat Helen, perfectly dressed in a navy suit that seemed to belong to another life. Gerald, with his cane tapping against the floor. Margaret with her lips pursed into a line of judgment, and Daniel Moore leaning back as if the chair belonged to him. Judge Lane presided, a man in his late 50s with gray hair slicked back and glasses balanced at the edge of his nose. He didn't look like someone impressed by theatrics. He looked like someone who had already seen every trick and still waited to be surprised. Ortiz rose first, laying out the case with the steady tone of a man threading a needle. He placed copies of birth certificates on the table, slid over bank statements showing Richard's transfers, $500, $300, month after month. "This is a father who never abandoned his children," Ortiz said, his voice measured. "This is a man whose name was erased, not by law, but by manipulation." Helen's attorney, a polished figure named Grant Collins, stood with an air of certainty. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Mr. Harris was absent. He left his family in need, and Daniel Moore stepped in. The children see him as father because Richard was not there." Richard wanted to leap up, to shout, but Ortiz placed a firm hand on his arm. "Wait," the gesture said. When Ortiz called Ms. Karen Blake, the old schoolteacher, the room shifted. She walked slowly to the stand, her cane echoing against the marble floor. Her voice cracked but carried weight. "I worked at Jefferson Middle School for 20 years. I remember Clara and Ethan. I also remember when the records were changed. Mr. Harris's name was there. Then suddenly it wasn't. I was told not to ask questions." Judge Lane leaned forward. "Told by whom?" Blake hesitated, then glanced at Helen. "By the administration. But I was told it came from the family." The silence after her words was sharp enough to cut. Gerald broke it, his voice shaking but angry. "We did what was necessary. Richard was sick, weak, useless. We protected those children from a man who couldn't provide." Finally, Richard spoke, his voice low but steady. "I was never useless. I drove trucks across this state with fevers that would put a younger man in bed. I sent money when I had almost nothing. I stayed alive when giving up would have been easier. And now you stand here and say I was gone?" His eyes found Helen. "Gone or erased?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably, for the first time looking less like a savior and more like a shadow caught in daylight. Judge Lane adjusted his glasses, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This case is no longer about absence. It's about intent, and the evidence suggests a deliberate effort to remove Mr. Harris from his children's lives." The storm that had been building for years finally cracked open. Truth, once whispered in the dark, stood in the light of a courtroom. The air in the courtroom seemed heavier that morning, as if every breath was weighed down by years of silence. When Judge Lane announced that Ethan and Clara would be called to the stand, a ripple of tension moved through the gallery. Richard felt his chest tighten. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, yet now that it was here, he wasn't sure if his heart could take it. Ethan walked first. At 18, his shoulders were broader, his steps more assured. But Richard still saw the boy who once held his hand crossing the street in Tampa. Ethan took the oath, his voice steady, then sat. He glanced at Richard only for a second, long enough to send a spark of recognition that nearly undid him. "Mr. Harris is your biological father," Ortiz began gently. "Can you tell the court what you remember?" Ethan's throat bobbed. He looked at Helen, then Daniel, before turning back toward Judge Lane. "He never left us," Ethan said, his words sharp in their simplicity. "I always knew. Even when they told me he was gone, I knew he was out there. My father." The room stirred. Gerald muttered something under his breath, but no one paid him any mind. Helen's eyes flickered, a flash of panic beneath her practiced calm. Next came Clara. She was 16, her long hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked younger than her age, maybe because she was carrying the weight of too many adult lies. When she sat down, her hands trembled, and Judge Lane gave her a moment. Ortiz spoke softly. "Clara, do you want to share how you felt during those years?" Her eyes filled instantly, tears sliding down her cheeks as if they had been waiting for this permission. Her voice cracked. "I just wanted my real dad back. Every birthday, every school play, every night I cried because it felt like he was erased. But he wasn't. He was still my dad." A hush fell across the courtroom. Even the bailiff shifted uncomfortably, pretending to study his clipboard. In that moment, the case was no longer about documents or forged records. It was about children reclaiming their truth. Richard closed his eyes, his chest rising with something that felt like both pain and salvation. He thought of all those nights alone in dingy apartments, holding onto pay stubs and wire transfer slips as proof of his existence. And now here it was, his children's voices cutting through years of deceit, louder than any lawyer's argument could ever be. Helen lowered her head, her jaw clenched. But she didn't speak. Daniel tapped his foot rapidly against the floor, the sound betraying his discomfort. For once, the Harris family's confidence fractured, and the gallery could feel it. Judge Lane leaned back in his chair, his pen tapping lightly against his notepad. "The court has heard the children," he said, his tone carrying the weight of inevitability. "And their voices matter." Richard's hands trembled, but this time it wasn't from anger or despair. It was the fragile tremor of hope finally daring to surface. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood polish and stale coffee, as if justice itself had been waiting too long in the air. Judge Lane shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and for a moment seemed almost to enjoy the tension. Perhaps he did. After all, how often does a man hold decades of one family's fate in a single sentence? After reviewing the testimonies, the documents, and the voices that matter most, the children, this court rules in favor of Richard Cole. He is hereby restored as the legal father of Ethan and Clara Cole. The words landed like a gavel strike before the gavel ever fell. Richard's knees weakened. For a second he thought he might collapse, but instead he gripped the table so hard his knuckles whitened. He had been waiting for years, and now the law had finally caught up to truth. Helen sat frozen, her face drained of all color. She didn't cry, didn't protest, just stared at the polished floor, as if searching for a crack to crawl into. Daniel muttered something under his breath, half curse, half sigh, before standing abruptly. His chair screeched across the tile, a sound so sharp it drew every eye. Without another word, he walked out, his shoulders stiff, his exit as graceless as his arrival into their lives had been. Gerald and Margaret stayed seated, but their silence was louder than any objection. For people who had built their lives on appearances, the humiliation was unbearable. Gerald's hands twisted around his cane, his jaw set in the kind of pride that refused to bow even in defeat. Margaret clutched her purse tightly, as if the leather strap might keep her from unraveling. Richard allowed himself a smile. Small, almost private, but real. For once, he wasn't a man drowning in loss. He was a father recognized, vindicated. A whisper of bitter humor crossed his mind. It had only taken a courtroom, 3 lawyers, 20 years, and a pile of forged documents to prove he wasn't a ghost. What a bargain. As Judge Lane banged the gavel, the weight of years seemed to shift. Richard inhaled deeply, filling lungs that had known too much emptiness. The battle wasn't erased, the scars weren't gone, but something inside him was finally steady. The gallery slowly emptied, people whispering, some shaking their heads, others wide-eyed from witnessing such raw family drama unfold. Richard stayed seated, watching Ethan and Clara approach. They didn't rush, didn't shout. Ethan simply placed a hand on his father's shoulder, firm and grounding. Clara leaned in and whispered, "We told them." And just like that, Richard knew the verdict was more than legal. It was blood calling to blood, truth calling to truth. He was home, even in a courthouse. Richard stepped out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light, the heavy wooden doors creaking shut behind him. For years he had walked out of rooms with nothing but silence trailing him. This time 2 shadows followed close, Ethan and Clara, taller now, their steps uncertain yet drawn to him like tides to the moon. He didn't speak at first. He just listened to the sound of their shoes on the stone steps, a rhythm he thought he had lost forever. When Clara's hand brushed against his, he closed his fingers over hers instinctively, like a man grabbing the edge of a lifeline. Ethan walked beside him, not needing to say much, his quiet presence declaring more than words. Is a father measured by blood or by presence? Richard asked himself silently. The answer floated somewhere between the years of missed birthdays and the unbroken thread of love that had never been severed. Presence could be stolen, twisted by deceit, buried under lies. But love? It had a stubborn way of surviving, like grass breaking through cracks in concrete. They reached the sidewalk. Life carried on around them. A bus engine roared, a man shouted into his phone, a vendor sold hot dogs at the corner. Ordinary sounds, yet for Richard they felt extraordinary. He had been living in the shadows, but now every ordinary thing was proof he had been returned to the world of fathers, to the story that was his. Ethan turned to him, eyes steady. "We'll figure it out, Dad." Clara squeezed his hand. "We just want you back." In their voices, Richard heard not just forgiveness, but a promise. The past could be remembered without being repeated. He thought of all the wasted years, but also of this moment, sunlight, the laughter of strangers, the simple fact of walking beside his children again. A father is never replaced if he still lives in his children's hearts. That truth had carried him through the years of silence, and now it rang louder than any gavel, more binding than any legal document. The story wasn't tied neatly with a bow. Life rarely was. But for Richard, the ending was not an ending at all. It was the first page of a chapter he thought he'd never get to write. He glanced at the horizon, imagining dinners not yet shared, birthdays not yet celebrated, phone calls waiting to be made. And perhaps one day, a knock at his door, not from the past, but from the future. Healing, like love, was never quick, but it had begun. Sometimes the deepest wounds carry the greatest lessons. Time doesn't erase love, it only tests it. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Wishing you health, peace, and happiness with your own families. Stay tuned for the next video, where another story awaits you.